Hello everyone. Today I want to talk to you about how you can improve your Minecraft builds using some concepts from anthropology. Now I want to preface this by saying that I am currently going to university for cultural anthropology. Cultural anthropology is the study of culture and social relations among people. Now culture specifically is defined as the knowledge, beliefs, arts, morals, laws, and habits tied to a social group. Although you can find tons of people arguing about the real definition of culture. Today, I want to talk to you about some world building tips using these 5 locations from my Cheddar province world. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Our first example comes to us in the form of Bexel. Bexel is a small desert town right on the Summer Sea, which you can see just behind me. Now this is important for a few reasons. Firstly, I want to talk about geography. Because there aren't a ton of trees or stone around Bexel, most of this place is built using a mix of sandstone, mud brick, and reeds. Now we have mud brick from this river oasis here. We have sandstone from the quarry, and we have reeds from the sugarcane that they're farming over there. This is also important for the city's diet. So of course they're going to eat a lot of fish, which if we come down here, we can see that there's a fishing area. We're also going to be eating a lot of melon, and there's melon growing along the river here. We're going to be eating sugar because there's sugarcane, salt because there are salt flats, and a little bit of bread because we have some wheat here. We can see that they can also import some food because there are ships coming in. Now, another part of culture that's important are the beliefs. In Bexel, this is primarily represented by the mosque here in the center of town. One key difference between this mosque and a more traditional Islamic mosque is that here we have cremation, which is another belief in Bexel. And if we come inside, I just want to show you that here we have two areas segregated by gender. So we can see that things like gender segregation are also important in the belief structure of Bexel. I want to also talk about pottery at this point. So because we have that mud from the river, one of the main art forms in Bexel isn't going to be stuff like painting or statuing. It's going to be pottery. And here we have that represented by a pottery market stand here. Whoops. As well as a pottery area back here with a big kiln working. So we've talked about a few things that are already important. The last thing I want to talk about are habits. Because it doesn't rain in Bexel, there are flat roofs, which means that people can use the roof space for a lot of important stuff. One of these things that I want to point out is sleeping. It's going to get really hot in any kind of desert place. So when it gets too hot and stifling inside of these buildings, people, especially young men, are going to come out and sleep on the rooftops. This is just one way that you can represent some unique habits about your builds. Our second concept here is stories and storytelling. Now, stories are told in every culture. A big part of why is to give lessons and morals, especially to the younger generation. You can think about things like the Wendigo story in Northeastern Native American storytelling, which tells about things like greed, cannibalism, and especially turning on your own people and kind of consuming them, which is a manifestation of greed, really. Now, we can think about spaces for storytelling in our worlds. One that I like is that throughout this castle here, Castle Leslie, there are these braziers burning, and I like to imagine people, standing around here and just telling stories to each other on a cold night. I think it's a lovely visual. On the other hand, we can think about things like storytelling traditions. Are the stories in your world or in your settlement or society primarily told orally or written? If you mostly have written stories, you should probably put in a library. If you mostly have oral stories, you should definitely think about putting in central community gathering spots where everyone can come and listen to those stories. You can also think about stories that are told through the buildings and the landscapes. Castle Leslie here is a fun example because the story of this place is construction and growth. We can see that there are older parts to the castle, and there's another one here. Then there are some newer bits, like all these pointed areas that come out. And then there's even a part here that's still under construction. And that's why there is an area out here for construction workers. So, looking at Castle Leslie, we get a story of construction. On the other hand, we can also look at the landscape around here. Most of this place is untouched, which tells you that they're probably importing almost all the building materials. The fact that they don't want to completely decimate the landscape around probably tells you that they have some kind of eye for aesthetic beauty. They don't want this place to just be a clear-cut forest, they want it to be a lush, lively forest. So, all those things are going to tell you something about the culture of a place. Number three, labor. Labor refers to the way that people make a living in their natural and social environment. Now, the first thing you might want to think about are people getting paid in stuff like food and beer, like in ancient Egypt, or are they getting paid money? If they're getting paid money, you probably need a place that makes money, like a mint. You can also think about housing. If you do something like build a big old factory, like that one over there, you have to think about where the workers are coming from, which means you're going to have to think about things like how many beds are around the place. Theoretically, each worker in a mill has to have a place to go home and sleep at night. You're also going to want to think about how many chairs are around the dinner table. In this house, we can see that there is one cramped little bed in the corner and then two chairs, so that's probably two people who live here. The total population of Edgewater is probably around 10 people, maybe less. We can also think about seasons. Are people moving around your world to work seasonally? Say, working to go harvest the fields in the summer or in the fall? Do people come clear the snow out of the city in the winter? Are there places that pop up every season and then they become abandoned again for a few months? These are all important things to think about. You can also talk about land ownership. Are the people who living here renting? Do they own the places? Are they living as peasants on land that's owned by the king? Or if you're doing something a bit more modern, by the federal government? These places are all just being built here because no one really owns the land. On the other hand, in the city, people do own the land, which is why you can see things like houses up for sale. No one would ever really put these houses up for sale because it's just not that kind of system. We can also talk about working conditions. For example, if your workers are being well treated, you can imagine something like a feast or a festival being thrown in a grassy field for their honor. So you can think about things like garlands and banners strung up, and you can think about a table full of like cake and pie and steaks and stuff. On the other hand, if they're being mistreated, you might want to build a union house where the people are gathering together to strike against their bosses. You can ask your question, are there unions and are there guilds? In the Middle Ages, we're talking more about guilds, but in the Industrial Age, we're talking a bit more about unions. In terms of building, even if you want to build a guild or a union, you should decide whether this is kind of like a secretive underground sort of place, or if it's a well-known thing that everyone can show up to the union house and get support from their other workers. You can also talk about training. You can consider building something like a university, or maybe a boot camp for soldiers in the city watch, or a medical school. On the other hand, if we're going for more of a rural setting, maybe put an extra bed in the blacksmith's house to show that he has an apprentice living with him who's trying to learn the trade. Point number four, migration. Migration is the movement of people from one locality to another. In this case, you can think of locality as just a space that you think is meaningful. So if moving across the river is meaningful, then that can be your locality, or maybe they have to move across the country. Now, there are parts of migration that you should be thinking about in your builds. For instance, if you see a big city like this, Saint-Neville, ask why is it growing? Are there better jobs in the city? Are people getting paid more? Is that why? If a lot of people are moving to the city, are there suburbs popping up like Edgewater, which we just saw outside of Regensburg? Is this new city named after an older place? You can think about places like New York, Boston, or Plymouth in the US Northeast. And you can also think about whether your city was planned to be this way or if it just kind of grew naturally. So, is your city on a grid or are all the houses touching each other? Saint-Neville here is kind of a mix of the two. So, there are a lot of places touching each other, but there are no shanty towns. There are no like quickly built houses that are about to fall down. It's still a pretty nice, rich settlement. So we can see that there aren't a ton of people moving here. So there's probably a pretty restrictive migration process. Speaking of, we can talk about mobilities. So who can migrate? In the real world, it's mostly the middle classes who migrate. Anytime, say, there's a war in the place. So poor people mostly don't have the means to migrate because migration is a very expensive process. You need a lot of money, say for plane tickets, for paying people to move you, for renting an apartment in a new place. All talking about the real world. But of course, this applies to your Minecraft world as well. How easy is it for people to move around, and what kinds of people move around? If a city is destroyed, do they all go to another city? If so, is there like a slum outside full of refugees? Maybe you want to tackle some of those topics in your world, or maybe you don't. But these are all just things you can think about in trying to build a more alive and a more living, tangible kind of place. You can also talk about ruralization. So, ruralization is the opposite of urbanization. It's when people move back into the countryside. Sometimes this happens because there's something like a war or a conflict. You can think about cities getting destroyed, and maybe the people just go live on farms because no one else will take them, and it's what they used to do anyway. So they just go back in and start living like their ancestors did. On the other hand, maybe rent is really expensive in the city, and maybe people are slowly moving out because it's just unlivable. This might be the case in Sarneville. It's a pretty rich place, and I can't imagine a lot of people moving here because it's probably pretty expensive to live here. We can also talk about things like transportation. I talked a lot about this in my last video on connecting your builds, if you want to check that out, but I'll briefly go through it. So, is it easy to move around your world? Um, One way you can make it easy is with trains and railways, but you could also have airships. You could have things like blimps and hot air balloons, in which case you're going to want to build docking stations high up on the buildings. You can also put horses and camels and llamas on the roads. If there's a lot of horses around, you might want to have stables. In this case, the only real place to stable your horse would be to put it out here. So there's not a lot of horses coming in to Saint-Navid. We can also talk about riverboats. So in this case, Saint-Navid is on a lake, so there's not really much place for boats to come and go from. But if you have a lot of your cities on a single river, maybe there's boats that go between them transporting goods. On the other hand, we can think about traveling caravans. So think about like the Khajiit in Skyrim, who set up tents outside of cities whenever they travel. You can also consider military checkpoints. In the case of Sandeville, of course, there is a border post right here. So the only way to get in and out of the city is to come to this post here and check in, basically. So it's a pretty restrictive process. On the other hand, you can think about bandits. Are there bandits hiding in ruins nearby? Or are they hiding in like a camp in the woods, like Robin Hood? And lastly, you might want to think about passports. So passports are mostly a pretty new thing, but the ancient Roman Empire also had passports. Anytime you have a really big bureaucracy in a place, you're going to want to know who's coming in and out of a territory in an organized way. So that's something you can think about. Are there passports in your world? Is it easy for people to get a passport? Does it make it really hard to get around if you don't have one? One last thing you might want to consider is aging and disability. Now, thinking back to our other topics like cultures, story, labor, and migration, you can think about those things like how do old people feel about a culture versus young people? How do they transmit a culture? A lot of stories are intergenerational. So, a lot of times people tell stories to their kids and grandkids. You can also think about labor. Labor is mostly performed by younger people, especially labor outside the house is going to be performed mostly by young men in most cultures, whereas labor inside the house is primarily going to be done by women. Again, this might not be the case in your culture, but you want to consider whether this is the case for your builds. Now, we can also talk about the roles of old people and especially disabled people in a society. Are old people primarily storytellers? Do people retire? So if someone's like 65 and they've been working in a factory. Is there some kind of retirement in your world? The reason that I'm here specifically in Regensburg is because this house is a clinic. So this is Doc Mercer's. And if we come inside here, we can see that there is a railing up against the stairs, making it easy to get up and down. Um, the idea here is that somebody in the house is probably old or disabled, so it was hard for them to get in and out of their own bedroom, so essentially they built a railing for the stairs. And that's something you can consider in your world. Um, so if you just built a house in Minecraft, could somebody who can't move their legs get around the house? Are the stairs steep? Do they have railings? Is the house 2 stories? Does it have to be? Maybe people who are old and disabled in your city prefer to live in single-story houses, in which case you should probably have a couple of those. On the other hand, you can think about wheelchairs. You can think about glasses. Do these things exist? Is there a guy in your city who makes glasses for people who can't see well? Are there clinics and hospitals? Are there apothecaries, chemists, druggists, or whatever other words you want to use for somebody who essentially sells medications and potions and stuff? We can also talk about status. In some communities, elders are going to be more central, and in others, they're going to be more marginal. Marginal just means that they're kind of pushed to the outside. If your elders are more central to your community, think about having really big houses where multiple generations live together. Say people live with their grandparents and great grandparents, even, because those people are really important to have around. Versus in a culture where they're more marginal, old people are primarily going to live, say, by themselves or with a spouse, but not really with the family. We can also talk about the status of disabled people. This is a really big city. So, could the leader of a big city like Regensburg be a disabled person? Could it be somebody who uses a cane or a crutch? Um, if so, what does that say about Regensburg? If not, again, what does that say about Regensburg if somebody who's disabled wouldn't be considered for government? We can also talk about having a place in your settlement where people sell say anti-aging potions or like potions that say that they're going to restore your vision. If you have a culture where people are really scared of aging, you're going to have a culture where people sell anti-aging solutions. On the other hand, if most people embrace aging, then you're going to have a place where people aren't really that interested in setting up a market for those goods. Thank you to all of you who came to this anthropology lecture today. I hope you enjoyed this kind of unique perspective on world building. We talked about using culture more broadly, ways you can integrate stories, ways you can talk about labor and migration, and also aging and disability. To recap some of the ideas we talked about, consider how easy it is to move around your world. Consider these social positions of people who are old or disabled. What kind of positions can they hold? Can they be in government? Can they teach? You can also think about things like labor. Is there a union? Are people who work hard really celebrated, or is there some kind of stigma around working in the fields? Um, Say there's a stigma around working in the fields, you're probably going to want to have buildings that have very big awnings and a lot of interior space and a lot of places for people to avoid the sunlight, just as one example. On the other hand, you can think about military checkpoints and bandits and stuff like that on the roads. You can think about whether you want trains. If you want trains, you have to have a train station. If you want to have a hot air balloon, it needs some place to take off from and land in. Talking about stories. What does the layout of your place say about the story of the people who lived there and moved there? Is it on a grid system? Can you see signs of construction being done over and over? Are there a few houses and fields that are starting to be abandoned because the young people are moving away? These are all interesting things you can talk about through your builds and through the way that you imagine your builds. If you think about all these things and if you consider all of them, they're going to shine through your builds and make them feel a lot more lived in. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.